Released in August 1997, 2 years after the film it was based on, Goldeneye is a first-person shooter developed by Rare for the Nintendo 64. This was by no means their first time working with the Big N, as Nintendo had reportedly backed Rare with a seemingly unlimited budget, as far back as the NES. Wizards and Warriors, Battletoads and RC Pro-Am were all popular titles for the Nintendo Entertainment System, which saw Rare fast becoming a prominent second-party developer for Nintendo, who went on to own a large minority stake in the company. With titles like Donkey Kong Country and more releasing on the SNES, the hits just kept coming, so it probably surprised nobody when they were given the chance to develop the Goldeneye game. What Rare did next was surprising, however. Originally suggested as a 2D side-scrolling platformer for the SNES, Martin Hollis, the game's director and producer, proposed a 3D shooter game for the Nintendo's then-in-development Ultra 64 console and began assembling a team. Of the 10 developers selected, 8 had never previously worked in video games. Hollis had a vision, however, and for the first few months, GoldenEye's development team worked on an on-rails light gun style shooter. Although the style was abandoned later, Virtua Cop was still credited by Hollis as influencing several aspects of the finished game. Taking 2.5 years to develop, GoldenEye's creators were afforded nearly everything, even visiting the film studios while it was shot, to collect photographs and get blueprints of the sets that were used in the movie. They even had the initial idea of representing 4 different save slots used in the game as pictures of previous Bond actors in homage to their greatness, but Rare didn't have permission to use their likeness, so instead all save files would have Brosnan's picture in the final game. As development continued, Silicon Graphics, Onyx workstations and Nintendo's own Ninja development software were used to create geometrical virtual environments based on the film, but most missions were extended to allow the player experience sequences James had not. The then inexperienced team concentrated on level design, focusing on creating interesting spaces and the placement of start and exit points ever before the characters or objectives were even considered. This later gave the game a more realistic non-linear feel, as there were many routes and objectives across each level, something that was inspired by the multiple tasks in each stage of Mario 64. GoldenEye is commonly credited with introducing stealth into first-person shooters, something that had not previously been seen. Firing a weapon would alert all those within a certain radius, and firing that same weapon again within a certain amount of time would increase that radius again. Basically, it was in your interest to not shoot and wait for the timer to reset, as this increased your chances of success, something made easier by using the many windows throughout the game, an intentional feature included by the developers that allowed the players to see through them, but enemies could not see you. Because the N64 specs or dev units were not initially available to Rare, a modified Sega Saturn controller was initially used to playtest the game, and it was pure guesswork as to what the console's final capabilities would actually be. Ultimately, the new Nintendo hardware could render polygons faster than their Onyx workstations, but unfortunately for Rare, the standard of the game's textures would have to be halved. Believe it or not, GoldenEye's famous multiplayer was not actually intended to be included in the game, and was essentially a complete afterthought. It was added very late in the development process, with the majority of work being completed by one person, Steve Ellis, who, according to David Doak, the game's writer, turned GoldenEye into a multiplayer game. There were many items changed or removed from GoldenEye's final release, from the initial 2D platforming or rail-type shooter, or even reloading your weapon by unplugging and reinserting the N64 controller's rumble pack, something that was only removed because of orders from Nintendo themselves. We can only guess at the possibilities. But did you know that before they were Rare, they were Ultimate Play the Game? Ultimate was the trading name of Ashby Computers and Graphics Limited, and went on to evolve into Rare. But before that, they were a very successful video game developer for the ZX Spectrum, Amstrad, MSX, Commodore 64 and more. Seeing the appeal and feeling nostalgic for the Spectrum system they'd worked on all those years ago, Rare and staff began experimenting with its emulation on the N64 console, and in short, it was actually quite successful. Every single copy of GoldenEye has a fully functional ZX Spectrum emulator and 10 Ultimate Play the Game developed titles built in. Unfortunately, as it was a simple experiment to see if it could be done, the emulator was disabled within the coding before the game's release, but not deleted entirely. This means if you'd still like to access the emulator today, you can, by using an N64 emulator and a fan-developed patch for the game. There's no denying GoldenEye had a massive influence on first-person shooters, and it went on to have huge commercial and critical success. Selling over 8 million units worldwide, it is the third best-selling Nintendo 64 game of all time, a massive achievement behind only Super Mario and Mario Kart. Highlighted for its blend of strategy, stealth and gunplay, it received several Game of the Year awards and is believed by many to be one of the best video games of all time.